this session from Tuesday to tonight. Sorry about that, but some of my family have come down with COVID, and so we had to move our sort of schedules around. Hi, Wendy. Thanks for joining, and I'm kind of relying on you a bit to sort of critique and challenge and support some of the things I'm going to say here, because I know you know a lot about psychological safety and did a really good evidence review on Science for Work. So, okay, I'm gonna start. We've started recording. So, welcome to this session on psychological safety. This is our the third session that I've run so far on building organisational change capability, and this is all related to a session that we're having on the 4th of August, building capability for organisational change, where I'll be introducing a framework for how we can diagnose areas where organisations need to improve their capability to change, so they'll be ready for any change. And this is an evidence-based approach, and I've broken it down into 16 competencies. And we've started with trust in leadership, which is one of the competencies. We've done fairness. We're now doing psychological safety. We've also got organisational support, which I'm working on, which is tough, and relationships as well. So we are looking at the sort of interpersonal side of organisational change capability. And here is the model, and you can see on that bottom left-hand side, I've just called that organisational learning, but this is the sort of interpersonal aspects of capability. And then there are the individual aspects, which is resilience, adaptability, autonomy, and efficacy. I think I've put a meeting out for resilience, so we'll be going through that. And then there's the sort of the objective external individual capabilities. That's being goal directed, job quality, accountability, and dialogue. And then there are the other four inter sort of objective areas, which is there a clear sense of purpose, and how are we managing performance and developing people, and trust, which we've already covered. And just a quick sales pitch on this model. This model's been put into sort of a sort of GUI type thing, graphical interface, and you can basically take the assessment and then you end up with some graphics, and you can calculate what the interrelationship is between all these different factors. So here, for instance, you can see psychological safety has the thickness of these lines, so it's very correlated with all these other areas, and we'll show that's supported by the evidence, or you might run it in an organisation and find it's not supported by an evidence, which is a good sort of conversation starter. It also shows this large area means, the green large area means that it's important to people in the organisation. So we ask people to rank how important these competencies are for them. And the green means that they're currently performing quite well. And this creates a sort of a strategic narrative and a strategic plan for building change capability. So that's the sort of sales pitch bit open. On psychological safety, what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about why it's important, what it is, and how we can affect it, and what we'll see kind of when we're getting it right. So why is psychological safety important? And I'm going to come at this from a number of angles, because I'm trying to sort of pull together as many sources of evidence for organisational change as I can, which includes, complexity and systems thinking, and it includes some neuroscience as well, which I think ties nicely into the complexity work. If you come along to the neuroscience sessions and the complexity sessions, hopefully you'll see some of the connections there. So why I think it's important? Well, people have gone to a lot of effort to research this. There's 30 years worth of research, and we'll go into the history of how we came up, or how academics came up with this idea of psychological safety. So I think it's important we pay attention to it, and it is one of the, a very solid sort of construct, as it were, in psychology, organisational development, whatever you want to call it. And it underpins lots of other things as well. So if you're not getting psychological safety right, the likelihood is that you're going to find it difficult to develop any other competencies. So it's a real mediator of lots of other capabilities like learning and trust in leadership. Um, and from a complexity or complex system viewpoint, it creates feedback loops. So if we think about complex systems stabilize themselves through exchange of energy, or we can call energy information, then organizations can respond or become agile to the external environments through information exchange. And that kind of makes a lot of sense because it's about creating learning environments and stuff. So we know psychological safety underpins that. I think there's also a duty of care here, and we'll touch on this as well, that if people don't feel they have voice in an organisation, then there's something fundamentally wrong and potentially quite oppressive about that kind of culture. So we will have a little look at that as well. And ultimately, it's about creating effective teams, and effective teams seem to rely more on contextual factors rather than composition. So it's not about the IQ level of the people that you're recruiting or what their personality types are, which is what a lot of team assessments will kind of lead you to believe. It's actually the context and the sort of the culture within that team that really defines whether it's high performing. And this is something that Google found as well, and we'll talk about what Google did around psychological safety. So so just quickly, sorry, and this shouldn't come out. Yeah. So there's been lots of studies, as I say, into psychological safety, and we can kind of break it down broadly into those things that seem to predict psychological safety, that seem to make it happen, that are kind of drivers. And these are things like role quality, trust in leadership, setting mastery learning goals rather than performance orientated goals. Rather than sort of complete this task by X time, it's more go out and learn something about well, psychological safety, and good cohesion, employee voice as well, and co-worker support. What I always find difficult about this, it's very difficult unless you've run a certain type of piece of research. It's very difficult to prove causality. So I've always got these two sort of headed bidirectional arrows, as it were, on both these sides. But this is kind of what people feel through longitudinal studies, that these are the drivers of psychological safety. And then the outcomes are these learning behaviours, employee voice as well, and improvement in individual tasks and subjective team performance. There was one particular study that looked quite robust that was talking about it helped people adopt digital platforms because they're able to openly talk about what they were kind of struggling with. So that's a key thing, I guess, for getting your adoption up in change programs. It allows people to participate more in decision making, which we know drives fairness in decision making, which we covered in the last session on fairness. And it also drives commitment on decisions. So if people think they've got skin in the game, they're more likely to be committed. And other areas which I've sort of put kind of question marks around, because we're going to dive into them a little bit deeper, and they are sort of composite ideas, or they're not that distinct as ideas, is that empowerment is needed in order to create psychological safety. And I think there's a complicated relationship there, which we'll come on to, and the idea of having a diverse climate as well, an inclusive climate, which we'll also dive a little bit deeper into later. So that's a basic overview of the relationships. So if you did run the diagnostic tool, this is kind of where you would be looking for high levels of correlation and the kind of relationships. And the Centre for Evidence-Based Management, if you become a member of that, I think you might be able to just sign up without paying and get access to their rapid evidence reviews. They did a rapid evidence review of psychological safety, which is basically just pulling together high quality evidence and just seeing where these relationships are. They were sort of pointing out that safety makes things happen, as I mentioned at the beginning. So you can have strong learning orientation within individuals within a team, for example, but if there isn't a sense of psychological safety, then team learning won't actually take place. So you can have the potential, but the potential won't be released unless you have psychological safety. Similarly, with learning style, if leadership style, you could have, there's a whole array of different leadership styles, but ultimately, if there isn't psychological safety, then those leadership styles won't create, innovative workplaces, proactive behaviour, constructive voice, organisational citizenship behaviour, which is basically people going the extra mile. And what I thought was quite interesting and quite complex maybe, but you see often in organisations, is that where you get teams that are highly specialised, maybe they struggle to collaborate with other teams that are maybe more cross-functional, and so they kind of stay in their own silos. And building psychological safety, I guess, building confidence in people's perception of people in those teams helps those people to go out to the rest of the business and collaborate. And that's obviously critical if you've got a team who are highly specialized, who you want to go out and collaborate with other areas or exchange kind of what they've been learning, then psychological safety underpins that process. And again, maybe this is applicable to high-tech companies particularly, and sort of and Google in this case, who ran this case study. And just my sort of blurb really on my thinking of my deep dive into complex systems. As I mentioned, if we're not exchanging information, and information is energy, because uncertainty and surprise is created by lack of information about situations, and that can be an energy drainer. So it's critical for creating energy in organizations. It creates robustness and resilience, because we know that if we don't have supportive networks and we can't create cohesion within teams because they're not communicating properly, then that doesn't allow the organisation to adapt and respond to its external environment, and doesn't allow individuals to bounce back because they don't feel there's support there, they don't feel their voice is being heard. Also, this idea of Bayesian updating and active inference, which I won't go into detail here, but this is about how we make sense of our world, how we update our beliefs. And again, if I can't share my beliefs or challenge other people's beliefs, which is what psychological safety helps us to do, then I'm not going to be able to make sense of my world. And memory and collective intelligence as well. There's a strong correlation between psychological safety and learning behaviours. So we can't create this sort of this collective intelligence that you see in highly collaborative teams and workplaces, and obviously it facilitates social interaction as well. So all these things are critical for complex systems. So essentially, an organisation as a complex system won't be able to work effectively if there isn't strong psychological safety. And this point about duty of care, that in the UK there is now an international standard for not just physical hazards but psychosocial hazards, and this was introduced last year. And you can see that bit that I put in bold there. So this is about how work is organised, social factors at work, and aspects of the work environment that might actually create trauma amongst people. So there is this duty of care that if we create an environment where people don't feel they can speak up, or the design of the work isn't suited to their skills, for example, then you end up with potential issues, and organisations potentially, I don't know, people taking out or lawsuits against their organisation or whatever for not complying to this standard. So, and it's interesting here that this Ipsos mental health survey suggested that 82% of people with diagnosed mental health conditions did not confide in workplace management. So they couldn't tell their managers, or didn't feel they could actually talk to their managers about the state of their well-being, or maybe issues outside of work. And also just a little warning sign that there's so much information out there on psychological safety. It seems to be quite a hot topic. It's very much in vogue at the moment. And it, I don't think it's going to go the way of growth mindset and fixed mindset, which there's lots of question marks about that work and its impact on performance. But there is a lot of stuff out there where clearly people aren't referencing the academic research, so they're kind of making stuff up, and they confuse constructs. So they confuse, trust with psychological safety, and Amy Edmondson's very clear about distinguishing those two things. And yeah, I just found it confusing. So the claim here from Great Places to Work was that they'd been measuring psychological safety for 30 years, but they haven't, because well, there wasn't the scale to measure it 30 years ago. And they were actually measuring trust, and I don't even know whether the way they measured trust was valid. So we need to be careful about some of the claims that are made in psychological safety. But hopefully this session will sort of endow you with more knowledge, or at least give you resources that you can go to get good sources of evidence on this. And just to reiterate, never believe a word I say on any of this stuff. Please go away and do your own research, and all I'm trying to do is just condense all the research that I read. And if you ask me questions and I don't fully understand things, that's because it's a complicated world going out there and trying to synthesize all of this stuff. So any questions, any comments so far before we get into the definitions of psychological safety? Am I doing okay? It's great to see so many people on the call, by the way, 27 people. So this is someone saying, who's this? Sorry, Lisa. As a psychotherapist who specializes in trauma, I want to confirm that PS is such a complex issue. Oh, thank you. And I'm doing a good job. Thank you. You're doing great. All right. Well, I'll carry on then. And hopefully you feel psychologically safe enough just to sort of chip in and talk. So please feel free to put your mics on as well. So I don't know. I mean, I always get kind of a bit bogged down in the detail of this stuff. And I do like going back into history, because I learned so much. I don't know whether you saw my first post of this year, which was a history of organisational development and organisational change. And I learned so much by going through that, and how advanced actually the thinking was during the 1960s, although they didn't seem to have the tools and the concepts to really sort of nail down their thinking. But we seem to have drifted away from that sort of great revolution that seemed to be happening in organisational development during the 60s. But there's a lot of stuff, well, almost all concepts seem to start in the 1960s, which we're using now. And this is no exception. So I found it interesting that this guy Sandler in 1960 was talking about this idea of background safety. So he was saying in psychotherapy that the ego will feel traumatically overwhelmed. Obviously, a throwback to Freudian language. But it was being used then in psychotherapy as an idea that people needed to have this sort of background safety when they're having conversations with their psychotherapist. And then Edgar Shen obviously has done a lot of work around culture, and Warren Dennis were talking about it being part of the unfreezing process in Lewin's conception of the three stages. So to unfreeze people's ideas and beliefs and opinions and things, we need to create psychological safety. And I think he was the first person to actually use the term. And then you've got sorry, 1990 shouldn't, oh yeah, no, 1990 is fine. And then you've got Kahn, who comes up with psychological safety as associated with elements of complex or social systems, and then you've got this idea that psychological safety should be used, again, Shen coming in and saying it should be used to overcome defensiveness, again, as a tool for change. And then you get this idea from Edmondson, who then became the person who really took psychological safety on and made it what it is today, which was her experience of being in in the medical profession and trying to go in to understand what the qualities were of high performing teams, a bit like what Google kind of did 20 or 30 years later. And she actually found that she was going to use a number of mistakes being made as a proxy for, one proxy for high performing teams. She found high performing teams who were high performing on every other factor seemed to be reporting high levels of mistakes. And she then subsequently realized that, well, they were reporting high levels of mistakes, not because they were making more mistakes, but just because they felt safe within their group that they could actually mention these mistakes and talk about these mistakes. And so psychological safety became, an idea that she had, well, actually, maybe this is one of the things that's underpinning high performing teams. So yeah, she sort of stumbled upon that idea, I guess. And sort of accidentally, and there's some nice YouTube TED Talks and stuff of her explaining all of that a lot better than obviously I can. And then after years of sort of doing studies and creating scales and creating surveys and being more clear about what the construct meant, Edmondson was able to do meta-analysis, and there's meta-analysis done by other people as well, just to say how important psychological safety is and how it relates to other constructs. And I just thought there's this idea that, particularly with the ISO standard coming in, that is creating psychological safety going to be a standard that organisations have to have in order to, a bit like paying people a proper wage, or being very clear about people's roles and responsibilities and stuff. There's lots of protection in law around that. And wonder whether maybe this is the new psychological contract around psychological safety and showing that organisations are creating psychologically safe spaces. That's a sort of a brief history which I thought was interesting. So what is it? Well, these are the definitions that have come up. Edmondson in 1999. People and feel comfortable about themselves in organisations, can be themselves in organisations, which I guess is a very early sort of conceptualisation of inclusivity and bringing diversity into the workplace, and being able to show one's true self without fear of negative consequences, which was Kahn's sort of definition. So I think all that, and Edmondson in one of her video chats talks about creates permission for candour, so people feel that they can be candid in what they're saying, that they don't have to hide what they're saying. They can be quite open and honest. And so I think a nice summary of this is it's just about really trying to create spaces that minimize interpersonal risk. So I run the risk of upsetting somebody, or I run the risk of upsetting the dynamics of the group if I say certain things, and psychological safety allows me to express my feelings and express my views as I see them, without fear of any sort of reprisal on me. And when you think about diversity and inclusion, you think that this is so important, that if you think people are using the wrong terms or the wrong phrases, or you think someone's being offensive in the way that they're using their language or whatever, if you don't have psychological safety, that stuff is not going to come to surface. So this is just some bullets that I just put together just to say what you might be, what you're not afraid of if psychological safety is there, and you're not afraid of making mistakes. So that's that example that Amy Edmondson talks about in the hospital. You'll take risks, raise problems, ask questions, and disagree as well. It's not necessarily a all positive thing, and we'll come back to some of the recommendations that Google made and sort of question some of those around creating psychologically safe places. That you don't feel sort of ignorant, that you ask questions, and you're not worried about feeling maybe a bit out of your depth, a bit incompetent, negative and disruptive. And actually, what I found interesting, and maybe there needs to be studies or more development on this, is that our groups that are younger, i.e. people who come together, they're potentially going to have stronger psychological safety, because they're more open with each other because nobody knows anything at that stage, and they're all forming relationships. So they're happy to put up their hand and say, yeah, I don't understand that, I don't know. They're happy to feel incompetent because everybody's incompetent. But then as groups become more mature, that becomes a lot more difficult, because I guess people are expected to know what they're talking about. And if you're new into a group as well, that can be quite intimidating, can't it? You come into a group and you kind of think people kind of expect you to know stuff, and maybe you don't. So maybe there's an interesting dynamic there about you know, the sort of maturity of organisations. And I love this. I love this diagram here, which was created by Wendy Hirsch, who I think is on the call. I think you created this. You do these great diagrams, and maybe you're better at explaining this. The difference between psychological safety and trust. So. So I've just realised actually that I've got these the wrong way around, which is a bit embarrassing. But you know, psychological safety captures the extent to which a person believes the other person will give them the benefit of the doubt. So I'm willing to sort of expose myself to other people, my views or ideas or whatever, to other people, and I will give them the benefit of the doubt. Whereas trust is more associated with the willingness to be vulnerable. So you give, you know, other people the benefit of the doubt. So that they are sort of two distinct concepts. I guess my way of getting around it is with trust, you're sort of absorbing what everybody else is going to yeah, whether you can trust them with information that you give them, whereas psychological safety is more, you know, will I be judged by that team when I say, you know, X, Y, Z. So there is a distinction, and I don't know if I've explained that that very well. But what underpins both of those, I think, is the idea of vulnerability. That if I'm a leader and I'm trying to create trust, then I need to be vulnerable with people to show that I'm kind of human and trustworthy. And if you're trying to create psychological safety, then the group have to allow people to be vulnerable. If that helps to explain it as well. Okay. And there's also a difference between employee engagement and psychological safety. I think there's often, you know, people are engaged, then they will feel psychologically safe, and being engaged is about bringing your full self to work. And actually, I think, you know, safety helps to sort of convert psychological safety. So if you're trying to get this balance, we're always trying to get this balance in organizations between a sense of autonomy and uniqueness and a sense of belonging. So Khan has put it here that we want to protect ourselves from isolation, which is we want to belong to something, but at the same time we can feel sort of engulfed by you know, other people's views and all the rest of it. So we've always got this tension between wanting to be autonomous and wanting a sense of belonging. And what psychological safety can do, I think, maybe, is create a balance between those things. And so Khan says this, you know, the behaviours by which people bring or leave out their personal selves during a role. So I make a choice whether I bring myself. So if I feel I don't need a sense of belonging, then I won't bring myself to the meeting and expose, you know, myself in that meeting, and I'll keep myself to myself. Or I might use psychological safety to express my autonomy and independence and challenge those groups' beliefs as well, which might actually push me out of the group slightly. So psychological safety, I think, is a nice way for me. I think it's a nice way of acting as a kind of mediator between a sense of autonomy and a sense of belonging in groups, and we can choose whether we're in or out by using psychological safety, if that makes sense. And I think this sort of comes through in this research that CIPD did. They did a rapid evidence review of employee engagement, and psychological safety, along with lots of other things, seems to act as a sort of connector or maybe a mediator between the amount of energy I put into my work, so work motivation, and my commitment, my emotional commitment to the organisation as well. So again, it comes back to this question of how much energy am I willing to put in, how much risk am I willing to take when I say something during a meeting. Is it going to be detrimental, and is it going to create surprise and create awkwardness, which is then that creates that's a sort of an energy drainer that creates surprise and difficulty within a group. Whereas if you've got psychological safety and you don't feel that, then when I express energy, it becomes so much easier to transfer my views, my information, and create stability within the group. And so I feel more emotionally connected to the organisation and to the group as well. So I think there's something there about connecting, energy and commitment, and getting that return on my investment of my energy within groups or within the organisation. And also, just coming back to this building an inclusive culture as well, which I mentioned at the beginning, I think that it creates this balance between uniqueness and belonging in groups and organisations as well. That I can express, if I can differentiate myself from other people by expressing my views because I feel psychologically safe, then I can go up that uniqueness side, the drive to stand out. But also, if I understand, that other people want to express their own psychological safety as well, then that gives me a sort of a sense of belonging to a group and understanding what those nuances are. And if I feel accepted into the group, then I'm more likely to feel that I'm fitting in, and more likely to give psychological or not give psychological safety to others, but more likely to be appreciative of other people's needs to feel psychologically safe as well. So that's another potential way of sort of expressing the importance of psychological safety. And remember, there was also this distinction that a driver of psychological safety, as well as a driver being diverse environments, another driver is a feeling of empowerment. So obviously, feeling of empowerment is about sort of delegating responsibility and feeling and team members feeling that they can make decisions, etc. But I just feel empowerment isn't a particularly well defined construct, and I'm not really sure how that relationship between empowerment and psychological safety works, because empowerment is meant to consist of these four factors: competence, self-determination, and impact. And my impact that I have is really a sense of autonomy. So can I affect my environment? So that's talking about autonomy. Competence is about maybe having learning goals. So can I and being self, or feeling a level of self-efficacy as well. So do I feel I can do things, which we know that psychological safety is a driver of both learning and feeling of self-efficacy and autonomy and impact as well. We know that self-determination is a theory that includes competence and autonomy and a sense of belonging. So I don't know, it just seems to be a bit of a mess trying to create a relationship between psychological safety and empowerment. But I guess ultimately you can think of it very high level and very conceptually, and sort of think, well, I won't feel as though I can make decisions, or I'm not willing to be held accountable for decisions, which is a form of empowerment, if I don't have voice in the decision-making process, and voice comes around through psychological safety. So maybe you can sort of conceptualize it that way. I think there's also, I think there's a thinking now around the dark side of psychological safety. So what happens when psychological safety goes too far? And we know in group dynamics, the positives or the benefits of having strong group dynamics are, differentiation, so people can differentiate themselves. It creates stress reduction because we're sort of spreading the load of making decisions. You get this collective intelligence, which we talked about, on social facilitation. But there is a dark side of having people who are uh, the bonds within the team are too strong, which is this sort of social loafing that I feel as though I don't have to say anything because I get on so well with people and everybody seems to know what they're doing. So I kind of stay quiet and let other people get on with stuff. There's a sort of group thing that we're just all nodding our heads and going in the same direction. It could be completely the wrong direction. That there is a sort of relational loss, that groups become so tight that if you bring in somebody potentially that they find it difficult to sort of establish themselves if there's high levels of psychological safety, or they don't understand what the norms are within the group, and they're potentially information hogging as well, and we'll talk a bit more about that, about one of the sort of undesirable potential behaviors. And Amy Emerson, in one of her, I'm not sure if it's a TED talk, talks about this balance between psychological safety and motivation and accountability, which I thought was quite useful, which talks about when you've got a high level of psychological safety, you can get into this comfort zone, which is maybe the dark side of psychological safety. If there's high levels of psychological safety but no accountability, then you get social loafing and you get groupthink, whereas you want to be dialing up accountability at the same time so you can get into this learning zone. So when we go back to that original model of building organisational change capability, we have to look at, if we are developing psychological safety within an organisation, we probably want to be developing accountability as well. Otherwise, we might end up in the comfort zone rather than the learning zone. And also, interestingly, some of the research sort of says what kind of personality types are kind of suited to creating psychological safety. So this is people who've got proactive personalities, people who are emotionally stable. So clearly, if you've got psychologically safe environment, people might say things that challenge your assumptions. So you've got to be able to take a deep breath and take it at face value, and sort of control your emotions. And learning orientation obviously helps as well. But there's obviously a loop there because psychologically safe spaces create learning orientation. One thing they did find, which I thought was interesting, was that openness didn't actually have a strong relationship with creating psychological safety. So people who are very open about the sort of values and open to change and all the rest of it, people within those or groups that have high levels of openness aren't necessarily experiencing psychological safety, which is maybe counterintuitive. And yeah, I think there's a being open to new ideas and different ways of doing things may increase the likelihood that individuals feel safe and taking risks and exposing everyone. But yeah, sorry, I was just trying to. Okay, so any comments so far before we get into the how can we make psychological safety happen? Is that all clear? Did I fumble my words over psychological safety and trust?
Hey, Alex, this is Wendy. Sorry, I can't access the chat, so that's why I've put on my microphone. But I'll just say that I acknowledge that I think that difference between trust and psychological safety, it does feel a little slippery, right? And trying to, I think even after we put out that article at Science for Work, that was one of the things that people were interested in. And for practitioners, I often wonder, how important is the label or word you put on it with understanding what it is. And I think what you were talking about is it really is something that happens at the group level. It's an environment, and it's maybe less about me as an individual thinking about you as another individual, and more about thinking about this team and what the team expects of me and what the team allows for me. So the other thing that you were mentioning a lot, which I was curious if you had seen the converse of, you were mentioning a lot of like I don't need to be afraid to speak up. I don't need to be afraid to contribute. And I think in some of Amy Edmondson's research I saw, it's also not only that I don't need to be afraid, but almost that there's begins to become an expectation that part of my responsibility of being part of this team is to speak up. So I find that interesting as even more forceful, perhaps, than lacking fear, is to feel a sense of responsibility.
Brilliant.
Thanks.
Thanks, Wendy. That's a really helpful summary. Yeah, so I think, yeah, that account, maybe that's what she's mentioning in terms of that accountability as well, is that there is, you're accountable for speaking up. And yeah, psychological safety only works, I guess, if people feel that way. And yeah, I like the trust idea. That trust, I guess, is me looking out as an individual to another individual, saying, do I trust that individual, particularly leaders, when we talked about trust in leadership, which seems to be so critical. So do I trust this person, versus psychological safety, which is looking around the group and saying, do I feel safe to say certain things, and are there expectations within that group for me to express my true feelings? So brilliant. Thank you, Wendy.
Exactly.
Very
you bet.
helpful. Okay, right, let's move on. So how do we make it work? So this is kind of a bit speculative, some of this, because I guess academic research is always sort of criticised a bit for not finding, practical solutions or interventions, maybe. So you can, treat this as it is. I guess this psychological safety is has more richness, because Google did this great piece of work called Project Aristotle, where they were trying to understand, what makes the perfect team, a bit like Amy Emerson did when she was doing her research in the late mid 90s in medicine. And the project took 2 years, had 180 teams and 37,000 employees, and they were trying to really understand, is it having smart people in groups? Remember, at the beginning we talked about the difference between context and composition of groups. So is it the composition, or is it the context of the group? And the answer they found was this concept of psychological safety. And I thought this was maybe a sort of a useful way of understanding that we create psychological safety, then that creates accountability, so people get things done on time, because people can hold each other to account, because they can be more open about challenging other people, and we can be clear about what our actual roles and responsibilities are, and we know there's a strong relationship between role clarity and psychological safety, and that creates meaning and purpose within those teams. So that's the kind of the idea behind it. And I was also, whilst I was scrounging around, Harvard Business Review, for what it's worth, is very good at sort of summarizing stuff and putting pretty pictures in. And there's this article that Amy Emerson did with Mark Mortensen. I'm not sure who he is. This was last year, about how to create psychological safety when we're sort of hybrid working, when we're sort of working remotely. And sorry, the icons, I hadn't changed them for some reason, bear no relationship at all to what's written in those boxes. So yeah, they were talking about setting the scene, creating shared ownership for problems, clarifying what's at stake. So I guess sort of creating that sort of sense of urgency, and then leading by their own behaviours, their own vulnerability. So I guess this is another interesting idea, where leaders are leading a group and they have to create trust through exposing their vulnerability, which maybe is related to psychological safety. So maybe that's interesting in terms of the relationship between trust and psychological safety. Take baby steps. Building trust, it takes a long time to do, and building psychological safety equally takes a long time to do, and can be taken away very quickly if you make. But interestingly, other research that I've read around remote working is that you can build. It's very difficult to build trust in when you're working remotely. But once you've built trust, it's actually more difficult to lose it than if you're working face to face. And the reason for that is because I can see all those behavioral prompts in the workplace, and I can see better how you act, in a meeting when I'm face to face. But it's much more difficult to observe those behaviours working remotely. So those behavioural cues that might undermine trust aren't so easily observed. And then there's sharing positive examples and being a watchdog on the behaviours, and I guess calling people's behaviours out, or individual calling people. I mean, my view of this is fairly kind of generic advice in a way, and you could probably use it for anything. You could use it for a change program. But anyway, you might want to go and look at that article in Harvard Business Review. And Amy says here, CEPI managers should not underestimate the extent of congruent communications and intentional interventions required for psychological safety. So it's something that you have to be very conscious of creating. It doesn't just come naturally. And I think this sort of this comes through in these other sort of 3 steps that I also saw. I think this is in Amy's TED talk, where she's talking about framing the work, so reminding people of the importance of interdependence, which is sort of creating this reason for speaking, and then modeling fallibility, which is that leading the way kind of behavior, and then modeling curiosity. So this is asking questions and sort of paraphrasing, and is this what I understood? So giving people a reason to speak. And actually, what was quite interesting as well as I guess a 4th one here, but is also modeling curiosity, is it's sort of embracing messengers. So when somebody says, "Oh, something's gone wrong," put their hand up and says something's gone wrong, then that's a good thing and something we should encourage, and we should we should jointly try and solve that. And one of the things Amy Emerson said is counterproductive to psychological safety, which maybe managers do try and create, is you find the solution, you find the problem. And this is what we normally think of accountable people doing. Accountable people go out and find problems and then solve it themselves, and then come back to their manager and say, "Hey, look, I've sorted that. That's okay." But of course, that's a missed opportunity to learn. So for psychological safety, it doesn't really work. Maybe it's a behaviour that you would want to see in someone who's being accountable, but it's not necessarily a behaviour you want to see in someone or a team that's trying to create psychological safety. And if people, I guess, have got very high levels of accountability and just all going away and solving problems themselves, and they're not coming into meetings and sharing that stuff, then you're at the other end of that spectrum that we talked about before. And this is my own method that I've used with leaders, actually trying to create trust. But this is just a general, I guess, sort of coaching tool, and used for interventions in behavioural change programs that I've used. And that's this idea of creating real behaviours, which is sort of reflecting, inquiring, affirming, and listening. So developing the relationship, and then ears, which is once you understand where somebody is, you can empathise, accept. Then you can start to reframe, which is obviously used a lot in CBT to help people deal with trauma or whatever, and share your own experiences as well. And this is why I don't think empathy comes first. I think empathy comes later. You've got to be seen to be listening and I guess invested in the other person before you can, because if you're saying that you're empathetic right at the start without understanding the issue, then that could be seen as being a bit disingenuous. So and then real is here. So then we get into this high performing situation, maybe in psychologically safe places, where we are calling people out who aren't delivering. We're recognizing people who are. We start to experiment maybe with our behaviors, and we start to experiment with our work as well. And we start honoring and doing what we say we're going to do, which is this sort of accountable behavior. And I just thought that's potentially a process. And yeah, we'll come on to the structure overview of psychological safety as well, if I think that's what you're mentioning there, Lisa. These are sort of drivers, so negative drivers and positive drivers, potentially. Lack of vulnerability, and I put in there solving problems alone potentially brings down psychological safety, so we talked about that. And these are Google's top tips for creating psychological safety, and I had this sort of negativity in the bud. And I'm not sure about that. I think to create psychological safety, I think, as you were saying as well, Wendy, was that there's going to be a bit of awkwardness and there's a bit of discomfort, and there's got to be a bit of discomfort, and teams have got to embrace conflict in a way in order for psychological safety to sort of develop. And we want people to call things out and challenge assumptions. So I wasn't sure about this, negative. I don't know what, I'm not really sure what negativity kind of means in this context. As long as you're not being deliberately offensive or disrespectful. So there's some other ideas, and then psychological safety in meetings as well. Some sort of tips there, and I'm going to skim through this because this is all available when you can in SlideShare. And we're running out of time. If you want to measure it, then you can. And in my assessment of organisational change capability, I use Edmondson and Woolley, they're 2000, but they've got reverse ones, and I switched the reverse on those. So in summary, the below the line behaviours is that you'll see, very quiet groups, no feedback, no challenging, lack of ideas, people trying to cover up errors, and no real ownership of anything. And if the above line behaviours that we'll see, open discussion, asking to other team members for help, so people being vulnerable with each other, lots of learning, and lots of sort of respecting individual difference within the group, which I think is is one of those critical behaviours. And people can describe. I think this is a nice challenge. Describe somebody else's contribution to the meeting. So you're really trying to understand another person's contribution to the meeting and role in that team. So that's it. And so that leaves us with sort of 7 minutes, I think, to have a chat about this. I have whizzed through those last few slides just to create some time. So yeah, there were some nice points here. Lisa, do you want to talk through? You've been typing a lot. Do you want to talk through some of your comments?
It's me. Sure. Hi. I have a family member in the background here. So, what we found in our consulting is that I come from a clinical background treating trauma, and so I have distilled the skills down. It's not a therapy session that we conduct at all, but what we do is that we help individuals become aware of their own, what's going on for them first, and labeling information for them, including their emotional states. Once they have that as kind of a compass, they realize what's going on for themselves and for others. The other piece is that when people are really extraordinarily stressed, as we all are right now due to global climate issues of economics and work and family, everyone is pretty much in defense mode. So teaching along with emotional intelligence skills, teaching people about where they are in their system of defense, if you will, and how less functional our brains really are when that occurs for us. So that really colors or sheds a different sort of light on what is psychological safety. Once we know that we're not all at our tip-top best, and we can then, I think, go into conversations easier about, well, let me give somebody else the benefit of the doubt, because sometimes I might be stressed and come across like a jerk. What we also do then is provide for people kind of a roadmap, not only about themselves, but of the other people's states and their minds. And then we give them actual tools or scripting about how to communicate in order to foster the right types of messages that will translate into psychological safety. I hope that's helpful.
No, that is, and I it's interesting when you read How Emotions Are Made by Lisa Feldman Barrett. She talks about creating a language around, or more nuanced language around emotions as well, which I guess is part of part of that, that if you can communicate your emotion, you can understand other people's, and you're more likely to give them the benefit of the doubt because they're describing how they're feeling. And yeah, that's very helpful.
That's right.
Thanks,
Well,
Lisa.
sure. I just want to say one last thing. What we also do is provide them with tools that I know from trauma treatment on how to shift the mindset out of defense mode. The first step is recognizing it. Then it's having to know what to do. And then the third part of it is practicing the tools to help us shift back into a calm mindset, because that's where we are the best in our humanity and can be the best leaders or team members that we can possibly be. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, saying that, actually, there is a model, I've forgotten what it's called, where you sort of explain, you express kind of, when you do this, this is how I feel, and this is how I would like, this is how you could change, or, how we can change the situation in order for me not to feel that way. I think maybe that's another tool as well. I'll have to go and remind myself what that was. But yeah, so I think that's great advice, isn't it? Finding different tools to try and create those conversations about when I feel safe and when I feel awkward. Brilliant. Thanks, Lisa. Any other ideas, thoughts, comments? I was going to use silence then. I've used silence before as well, where you just create a sense of awkwardness until somebody speaks. We've done that with building trust in leaders as well. We had to wait nearly a minute once, which a minute becomes an hour. But maybe that's another technique. Any thoughts on that?
Maybe I'll chime in. This is Lisa again. Hi. Silence is great, but it has to be tactical silence. So kind of knowing when to introduce it so that it creates a little bit of putting it back on someone else's lap, or opening up the gateway for, hey, I'm interested in your thoughts. So in an invitation, it can be used in either way. And then the other piece to that I want to say is that it reminded me of motivational interviewing, where sometimes that helps leaders or team members become more accountable. Like, what is your interest in this job, or what is your passion? And as we're maybe going through a merger, these are the ways, or what are the ways you could conceive your passion still being alive for you? Or let's reshape your job description, or what have you. I think the main piece for me about psychological safety is conveying that you're open to understanding the other person's world.
Mm.
And then helping them describe that to you, or a great leader, I think, helps to elicit that in others so that they can be seen and heard, and take a little bit of risk with that. Not everyone's ready to be psychologically seen either, though. So we have to keep that in mind. And if you don't mind, I'd like to add that I have colleagues of color who are with me in my consultancy, and there is a lot of talk and concern about colleagues of color feeling excluded and being excluded. And now we have more dialogue about, let's become aware of that. What are the signs and symptoms of that? How do we know when that's occurring? And then the steps to make sure that we hear from colleagues of color what they need. So what am I saying? To summarize it, great leaders or very helpful leaders, healthy organizations ask people what they need instead of kind of researching and saying this should do it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I love that idea of trying to understand other people's mental models, because this is all around sort of active inference, that our brains are projecting a kind of reality through our sort of various biases and the way that we see the world, and maybe actually psychological at a very base level or neurological level is actually what we're trying to do, is trying to get that mental model in somebody else's head out, so that I can then tailor my behaviors or tailor the way that I am appreciating where that other person's coming from. And I guess to get that mental model out into the open is where the vulnerability comes in, doesn't it? The risk of exposing, some of your maybe deeply held beliefs or views of the world.
Exactly.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Great chat. Okay, well, we're over time unless somebody wants to just chip in. I mean, this is the best bit of all these sessions, and I guess maybe we should have follow-up discussions, or we could extend, maybe just type a message if you think these sessions should be an hour and a half and we do an hour presentation and then half an hour chat. I don't know. I mean, the airwaves seem to be quite quiet, but tell me what you think. And I think we'll end that session now. As I say, please put your email in the chat, and I will share the slides and the sort of references that I've used. And yeah, just remember that I'm not an expert on any of this stuff. I'm just sort of putting stuff out there and trying to synthesize. Thank you so much, Wendy and Lisa, who clearly have sort of practical expertise of applying this stuff, and can create a richer picture around these ideas. Brilliant. Thank you so much. And oh yeah, I've got to plug my next sessions, which are on support and relationships. So they're the next two sessions that I'll be running. Brilliant. Thank you.
That was so interesting. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. Who was that? Rachel? No.
Claire.
Claire. Brilliant. Thanks, Claire. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great evening. Thanks, Wendy.